We now know that these traumas are in our DNA, so it's not something you can just let go of. And even those of us who don't know, like a direct descendant that we have, like maybe it's a great-grandparent or someone who's no longer with us, we still carry the trauma in our DNA that passes on intergenerationally. So this was actually a very freeing thing to realize. Myself, my father was in a residential boarding school, and I didn't know that till well into adulthood. And he had been sexually assaulted there, and so 95% of the children, male and female, who were in boarding schools were sexually assaulted. So we think that when we look at the power differential or the power abuse that comes out systemically from the very structure that was set in, we think that if we practice interdependence and not, power over anyone or competition, if we don't objectify anything or anyone that, especially children, then no violence would be possible because everyone would have the same sacred value and worth. And we think that if we look at this from an Indigenous perspective through the vision of the circle, that sexual abuse and all forms of violence would just disappear from the earth, which is something that the curriculum sought to accomplish. So what we do also is build cultural bridges. So we teach the culture. We teach our curriculum multiculturally, and that's really important to us. What we're feeling is that the structure itself harms everyone, so we want to teach the value of the circle. And by living according to the circle where no one has more power than anyone else, and every single being, in fact, in the universe is equal to everyone, so that human beings aren't at the top. They're one of the beings in the world that are interdependent. So that's one of the key things that we teach. And we've gotten rid of the word decolonization, actually, and we're now using re-indigenation and resocialization. We feel that re-indigenation kind of incorporates people from other cultures as well. What we need to look at is before that structure came into being. All of us were living connected to the land, and the objectification of the land can't be minimized when you look at the violence against women and all people of color, and actually all beings in some way are violated through that structure because it sets up a hierarchy that puts value on some people more than others, and we feel that that inherently is a moral and ethical issue that we wish to address in our curriculum. So we tried a lot of different things, and we ended up realizing that any bystander program that was based on the dominant cultural model was not working for the Indigenous community. So we said we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out what's wrong with this picture. So we started doing a literature review about what the values were intertribally. We realized that there were so many different Indigenous people. We wanted to see what were the common elements in all of the belief systems. And all Indigenous people have creation myths and have particular values. So after 2.5 years of reading about what the original people the values they lived by, there's a concept called the original instructions. Indigenous people know what that concept means, but I think a lot of other people don't, so I'll explain. The original instructions are what was given to human beings on how we were to live in balance and behave in the world based on the creation myths and all of the values and traditions of Indigenous people spoke of that all of nature provides us with everything we need. Human beings can't take credit for having created any of those things. Therefore, we are expected to actually have a reciprocal relationship, a relationship of appreciation, and a relationship of honoring all these beings that give of themselves that we might live here. on the earth. So what we did was weave all of those values after we did this literature review on the original instructions from all over the world, actually. So it's not just Indigenous people here. It's Africa, Central America, South America. It's all the different cultures from all around the world, actually. And they all had common elements, and that's because they were really connected to the land and lived sustainably with it and had an appreciation for everything that was provided, because people were seeing how they affected the natural world and that how people behaved influenced plants. So then we began to take all of the values that we came up with. Initially we had 26, but we whittled that down to 12 basic ones. And then we put all of the information around all of the instructions into those values and came up with actually a 13-module curriculum. The first module is simply acclimating people to how circle process functions. So, and the other 12 are the different values we came up with, and I'll show you this soon. The thing about the circle process that we teach is that it's completely democratic. We couldn't think of any other model, any other structure that was egalitarian in the way in which a circle is, because there's no up, no down, no beginning, no end. It's completely non-hierarchical. And the way the circle works is that it travels sunwise. So everything is related to the universe in this really amazing way. Like when we come into the world, we move sunwise. Like we come into the east, we pick up air, then we move to the south and we have fire and temperature, and then we move, to the water in the west, and then we go to the north, which is actually substance. So that's the circle of life while we're in the world here. When we leave the world, we go the exact opposite. We begin to lose substance in the north direction. We begin to lose water in the west. We begin to lose our temperature, our fire in the south, and then the final thing that we lose is our air. So you could see how this is modeled on a cosmological, natural world perspective. And also, when the circle is going around, when the person has a talking piece, or, oftentimes Native peoples use feathers. The reason we use feathers is we believe that, like the eagle that flies the highest above the clouds can see 360 degrees, and it knows what details that need attention. And human beings, on the other hand, need to sit in the circle since we're on the ground and we can't see from that lofty perspective. The only way we could get a 360-degree wisdom perspective is if we all share honestly, authentically, and radically from our place of knowing. And then we can fill in what the eagle sees. So it's a metaphorical kind of way of looking at things. And so we often use feathers. And while you have the talking piece, no one else can judge you, no one can interrupt you. And when it travels, the person doesn't have to follow exactly what you said, but people are impacted because you're listening 90% of the time. The real key to the curriculum and the circle is that you don't think about what you're going to say. You listen intently to what someone else is saying. So sometimes when the talking stick comes to a person, they're a little bit like, oh my God, what do I say now? And it's uncomfortable and anxiety-provoking for some. And it's an actual relief for others because they don't have to fight for time. They don't have to worry that they won't be able to get into the conversation. But for some people, it's anxiety-producing. So we just ask them to sit quietly and, let themselves have something bubble up to the surface. Listening in this kind of way itself is very transformative, and we teach it as a way of life to govern how we are with each other in the world when we have cultural gatherings. So, and the thing, too, about Native peoples is we don't have a sense of time. We don't believe in time, actually. And you could see that before the colonists came here, before time became a money issue and people were paid, based on a value, based on an economic system of value. People just got up during the day and they had their day, and they went along the, people lived in the world in a way that was more conducive to their spiritual understanding and relationship to the world, rather than to any, work-related time construction that got developed when the colonists came here. So when we teach, right, what we do is we teach according to the medicine wheel as well. So the circle keeper sits in the east and begins the first teaching of the day, and then there's the second teacher sits in the fire direction, and the third teaching is in the water direction, and the fourth teaching is in the substance of Mother Earth direction, or the earth direction. So what you can see when you look at this is that there are people sitting in between. So when we teach, the teachers have people who have spoken in between. So that makes the circle be very peer-driven. And people tend to talk to each other, not to the circle keeper, which I don't even know who in our group suggested that, which is awesome in itself, because it was a brilliant decision that's really impacted how our curriculum has gone. So these are the modules themselves, and I actually have them in the order in which they are taught. And this was based on our evaluation process. So the evaluation process, which I will really get into a lot, really has, really formed how our circle has developed over time, what kind of questions we ask, how we do it, and has driven the order of the curriculum. So the first one is it mentioned there when we just do the circle process. These are the 12 values themselves. So the peace and justice really talks about that true democracy where everyone's voice is equal to everyone else's voice. And the way that you would determine that is the person with the least, who is seen as the least in our culture, actually has an equal voice and is no longer least, where you don't have anyone who is not completely equal. So that's something that actually even Indigenous people thought would be difficult to achieve, but something that you would work towards all the time. So we include in there, the analysis of how, when the students are taken, that when that happened, that everything got objectified, because now the Earth's mother herself, who is a being in her own right, who we see as having the same rights as a human being, was now objectified. And Mother Earth is always seen as female, so we link the trauma of women with the trauma to the land. And actually, women's DNA goes back to the first person. And so women have a real unique, relationship to land, in that our DNA goes back like that. And that's something that is, just something that is the purview of female energy. And the environmental justice is about recognizing that all of Mother Earth is equal. All the plants and animals have a psychology similar to human beings. They respond, they have language, they communicate. We all know now that trees under the ground, connect and relate to each other and share space, actually. And economic justice, we all know that not everyone is paid the same. Women continue to be paid less. People of color have been adversely impacted, and people are seen as, given more value if you make more money. And, it's a tool to assess value, and it's often completely based on injustice, as we know. And also the gender equity is built into, reproductive rights for women. That's a key in the curriculum. And then we move on to respect and talk about, these relationships among all these beings, a radical shift in looking at the reciprocity inherent in all these relationships. If one thing disappears, then we're all impacted. And then beginning to live in balance with your life, recognizing it shifts your life if you believe that everything is the same sacred being as you are. And then when we talk about balancing, it's a lot of self-care, a lot of care for others, responsibility shared, and in our bystander approach, we're all completely responsible for what happens to anyone in the circle, and that there are ways for social action and just the way our social relations work, that we would have this complete reciprocity, and the courage to name when things are not going well, and these things are really hard in our society. I mean, you could see this now when you look at the government, because people don't even seem to have the courage, especially to name the wrongs that they're seeing. People make excuses, and these are the kind of things that come in a culture where everyone benefits monetarily for keeping secrets, being quiet, and it's built on judging people and assessing some people as actually illegal, and the situation with the immigrants, and when you see what happens to children in this process, you see that in the dominant culture there's been no qualms about when you look at the residential boarding schools taking children out of their homes and placing them in residential boarding schools, when you look at the legacy of slavery, where people were removed from their homes and they were, treated and sold and treated like there were no inherent sacred relationships in the families, then you can really see why it's important to really look at the impact, say, of mandated reporting and its, legacy of impacting people of color adversely and more people in the jails. These are all things that we discuss in our curriculum. And when we come to the place where you see the linkage of humility, compassion, I got humility twice, but it's supposed to be humility, compassion, and empathy are like the humility and the compassion have to come first before you can think about empathy, because a lot of people have a hard time with the term humility. For some, it kind of links up with humiliation, but actually humility is realizing that we're no more important than anyone else. Everyone is equally important. That's the concept of the humility. The compassion, you can't have compassion without equity, because otherwise it devolves into sympathy or pity. Compassion means that you truly can see yourself in another person's situation as an equal person to yourself. And that's critical in developing the skill of empathy, which I feel and the folks at Visioning B.E.A.R feel is a sorely lacking quality or value in this culture. Because of all the structural inequities built in, it's very hard to have empathy for people that you see as less than yourself. And you see that again in the immigration issue where, some people have no empathy for the fact that the children are being separated from families, or the fact that people are coming from places where they don't have the same opportunities. When you look at the Earth as a ball in space, in the big universe, it would be like saying one side of a little rubber ball is not worth the same as another part of the rubber ball. It's like we're one sphere, and really, in Visioning B.E.A.R's view, we should be able to move around freely upon it and actually have respect for the different plants that live in different places. So anyway, I'm going through a lot of those, but what I found in the empathy is that people who actually harm people, they have very little empathy often for the persons they're victimizing. And the people who have been victimized have oftentimes had problems empathizing with those who harm. So a key part of what happens in the curriculum is people begin to experience that we've all done harm to someone at some time or other, and that there are reasons and societal underpinnings that make us all responsible for all the forms of violence that happen, because if we continually treat people like they have no worth, that's going to come out in some way. And then when we get down to connecting to the land, we see some really dramatic shifts. And The sacredness, prayer, and vision quest piece really relates to treating the earth this way and also marking the important places in the universe that we take. Like when we reach puberty, you know, in Indigenous culture, often, you know, boys go out for their first vision quest. Now women also do that. And also there are reproductive, like moon lodges for women. And there's like, we work with the moons. There are new moon lodges for women and full moon lodges for men. And that these are all geared towards connecting people in more deep ways to each other. And generosity is recognizing, you know, that we didn't create any of these things. So therefore, you know, our goal is to be giving, to be reciprocal, to make sure everyone has enough, and to have gratitude for everything that we have. So when we start our sessions based on those values, the first question that we ask is, and this came through conversations with our evaluation consultants, who are Morgan J. Curtis, who this is like her big thing is about, you know, on evaluation. She's connected up with Harvard, but she really travels all over the world, helping people who do the work we do come up with evaluation tools that will really measure the behavior change that we seek, especially in prevention. And also Patrick Lemon, who's part of the advisory council to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, who's out of Oregon and has sat on, you know, many, you know, he works very closely with Morgan. He's really interested in evaluation, and he's done a lot of work in the Oregon Task Force for sexual assault. So actually it was Patrick that came up with this particular question, reflecting on the material we've covered in the circle before today and what has happened in our own lives between circle gatherings. What thoughts, experiences, or observations are you bringing to circle as we begin today? This one question just brings up so much integration of the material and actual, it's audio taped so that we get like people's own words on how their lives are changing based on their participation in this curriculum. And some pretty dramatic things happen. I'm thinking of, you know, a time where there was one of the women in one of our circles who was actually a provider. She was in one of the groups that we did for providers. She had to take care of a child when her daughter was going through a very difficult period of time, and because there was some abuse in the way her daughter was relating to her children, but, you know, she, the grandmother, stepped in and took care of them for a time. And then there became like strained relationships between her and her own daughter. So she was going to her granddaughter's wedding, and she was worried about it. And she was worried about how it would be, you know, when she met her own daughter at the wedding ceremony. And so she saw, like, she had been in the circle for a while, and she was actually thinking in terms of the circle, and she was wondering, you know, how she was going to do this. She was able to put her daughter first and her granddaughter first, and in no way did she want to harm this experience for her daughter. So when she got to the wedding, what she did was immediately go to her own daughter and say, you know, you must be very proud today about your daughter's wedding. And her daughter was surprised and just said, you know, I just thought that you know, weren't going to be really happy to see me in this. And she said, I don't know why you would say that. She said, well, my daughter sees you more as her mother. And she said, you know, that was just her talking like that because she was angry with you, but actually no one can replace you. And she said, I just stepped into your life when it was important that you have somebody and that she would be with family. And like the whole ice thought in the relationship started improving over that. And many people started talking about spending more time with their children, spending more time in nature, really getting connected, viewing children's issues as important to their own, and that we have all that documented in audio tape. And there were some episodes where people really changed how they related in terms of where they were more prone to violence in the past. Like we had some people who were harm doers in our circles, and they really shifted. One person had gotten evicted from her housing, and then she's continued to take our group, stay in the circle, even though that had occurred. We were doing work in the HUD community at that point with residents, and even though she was facing eviction, she completed the group, and it was for violence, that she was being evicted. And then another time, and this is a woman of color, and when she was in a store, and her child had dropped a glass of jelly beans on the floor, and this woman was saying she had to pay for it with cash, and she wasn't going to accept her EBT card. She said she knew that she could pay it with her EBT card, and ordinarily that she would have been really enraged, but she saw all the faces of us in circle, and she just said, could you please call the manager over? And when she, manager came over and just supported what she said. So that was like a different outcome than she would have had in the past, because she would have responded with violence in the past. So, and there were other examples that she gave. Another profound one, for those of you who were even on the last webinar, I talked about how she had run into this man wearing a Confederate T-shirt, a flag on his T-shirt, and she engaged him in a conversation for a whole half an hour, even though he said these things that would have been enraging, like you don't have a right to that information, you haven't earned that respect, and and then he said that that his people, white people, were the first peoples here. I take it he meant that he was connected to, he was English and connected to England, and that those folks were the first people here. And at all of that time, she was really not triggered by that. She just was getting clarity and understanding where it was coming from, and then she talked to this man about what her family's experience and history was in this country, and the two of them had this conversation for a half an hour. I think that's rather profound when you think about, what's going on in our world today, and how people barely can tolerate differences, and that has led to incredible violence and inability to listen to each other. So this question brings out a lot. And so what the circle does is engage in a lot of storytelling of this kind. Like people begin to share real incidents and experiences in their life, and in profound ways. Like they, like when I went to Washoe and did this in the tribal community, there were some elders there who spoke about incredible violence that had been done to them, as well as violence that they themselves had committed against the children. And they were able to do that without being judged and being heard compassionately. And they all now had a real commitment to providing safe space with children, bringing back traditions and ceremonies, and people talked about the different ceremonies they had. And what's really important about this curriculum is it can be taught no matter if you're tribal or if you're not. Everyone's been, as I say, impacted by this structure that we live under that hurts everyone. And people get to tell their stories about that, and to tell their stories about how they were harmed by that, how they were treated in school, the experiences that they had from the past, their experiences with childhood sexual assault and domestic violence. And people bring it forward, and then they talk about shifting that and changing that, and what these values need to be to make a change in that. So that storytelling really happens naturally, especially when I mentioned that we have the teachers sitting dispersed in the group. And we also teach in small groups of 8. And we found that people share what they learn in the circle with people outside the circle, and then they get to teach another 8. So this is a train-the-trainer things, no matter who takes it, whether it's already a provider community or a community in a neighborhood, those people become trainers of other people. And so the hard thing was really, in a circle approach, how we're going to quantify and qualify information that is done in a storytelling format. So that was a challenge for the evaluators. So at the end, I think there might be missing a slide here or it's in the wrong order. Maybe it's in the wrong order.
I think the order got a little messed up, Strong Oak.
Yeah, I think, let me see. This is the one that should be the next one, so I'll just put it in there. Whoop. Now the question, the circle, and I just gave a sample for the respect one. We start out with a question, and we ask people to write it on a 3x5 index card before we begin to share what we thought. And this way it focuses the circle in a serious way into looking at this issue, like how can we show and teach respect that would contribute to keeping children safe in our communities. We focus on keeping children safe because it brings everyone to the table. People don't necessarily want to come to a group that's, circle that's talking about ending childhood sexual assault. But when we say contribute to keeping children safe, in fact, it includes not only childhood sexual assault, but all the intersections that impact children's safety. And we find that really has a preventative value. And again, our evaluators helped us with all of these questions to form them in the best way. They've changed over time because we first started out with ending childhood sexual assault. So each question gets reviewed for effectiveness, and it may even change by next year. But each one of the curriculum things, like, how can we, act with courage in interrupting oppression when we see it with a concern for safety. That's like one of the things. Or we'll ask, how does humility and living with humility impact keeping children safe? And, it's remarkable when you focus on the children, people actually talk about having some humility and actually understanding that children have the same psychology as adults and the same needs to know what's going on, the same need for feeling empowered in the age-appropriate ways and to include them in life. And people begin to make really big shifts about how they talk to their children based on going through this curriculum. So then going back, the final question is, let me see, that was the first one. Okay, now this is the last question from today's sharing. What, if anything, moved you? What transformed you? What surprised you? And here we get a lot of immediate changes in attitude, where people say, I never really understood that, or I never looked at compassion as needing equity in order to be compassion. And people say, I'm going to have to think about that after today. So that's a frequent kind of comment that gets made. And oftentimes people will also share some brilliant thing that people said that they want to carry with them. And you see a lot of times people taking notes about things they hear. So anyway, let's see. And then after we have our session, the teachers, 4 of us, sit and we go over the session and we actually audio record it. If we all agree by consensus about stuff that was said when it wasn't being audio recorded, because there's a couple of rounds that there was no audio recording happen, then if we heard something in there that we all think is so relevant to the evaluation, it needs to be captured. If we all agree, then we add it to the evaluation data for that session. Now, as you can see from what I've said, this is a very time-consuming process, but well worth it. And I did not skimp, or Visioning B.E.A.R did not skimp in our audio equipment. Like, we have an excellent audio device that's really small, but it really captures in meeting format every voice in the room. It sounds like the quality is so good, it sounds like you're just sitting in the circle again. And then there's a transcription component connected to it. So you could pay to have it transcribed by someone else. We've chosen that we're just doing this on our own so far, and our evaluators are great because Patrick will say he's a glutton for punishment and he wants to transcribe. And then I got a Dragon Speak program too, where I can listen, then re-say it, and then it types automatically. That has been working pretty well. But it's so worth it because you have all this amazing data that you capture. The behavior change is so hard to capture in prevention, and we're getting a mother lode of behavior change documented that way. And now what we're challenged with is, aside from the questions we ask at the beginning of each module and capturing the behavior change there, we are now challenged, and this is where we are at right now. The evaluators said that it was their issue, because like we have them in our budget for the last several years actually, and they were looking for a model that would really capture a storytelling means of evaluation. And Michael Quinn Patton has a principle-based evaluation program, or his approach, and it's based on values. And what Michael Quinn Patton says is that people act on these principles, and the principles themselves are linked to behavior. So people's behavior could be understood by a value they have underneath. So what you want to do is focus on the values underneath and the principles that are being acted out behaviorally. It took a while to catch on to that. Our whole team had trouble with that. And our evaluation team, happy to say, we also do that in Circle. Like, we have Morgan and Patrick, and then every single one of our teachers who's ever taught and are continuing to teach are welcome to come and participate. So we've had as many as 9 people at our evaluation team meetings, and everybody sits in circle, and again, it goes around, and everybody shares what their experience is delivering the curriculum, how their experience of it is. And also we have the material that we've gathered. And then we figured out that we need to come up with 4 to 6 questions that would capture the cumulative impact of the curriculum. So we were, struggling with that because folks at Visioning B.E.A.R, we all thought, hey, we're already capturing behavior change. But this will capture, because the modules build on each other and have a cumulative impact, and these 4 questions would probably more easily show the impact of the whole curriculum. So, for instance, we might come up with a question that specifically addresses reciprocity in relationships and equity in relationships, where people then we'll take all that other data and be able to put it into those questions. And we're trying to figure out whether to ask the question outright from the people that are taking the training. So this is all up in the air right now. But it's we're close to publication time when this whole curriculum will be put in place, along with all of these, this particular part here, the 4 to 6 questions. I think we'll be completely finished with that and able to publish really very soon. And in the next few months, every one of the modules has been edited with a view to what's occurred in evaluation conversations. So it's edited, and then we decided that every couple years we edited it again because we're going to incorporate the wisdom that people said and add that into the curriculum. And so the people in the community who are living with this module on an ongoing basis, which is what Visioning B.E.A.R, our intertribal community here, will do, is by doing that, then it becomes like almost like an oral tradition in modern time, where the wisdom of the community members will be reflected in the values of the way we live that are violence-free based on this curriculum. And then they will truly own the curriculum. And I'm really looking forward to that because people's own voices will be in there. And it could be a voice of a 10-year-old child in there, because we've heard incredibly brilliant things from children who've sat in our circles. And their voices belong in this curriculum. So that constant editing is going to go on, which will influence how we put the publication together. And it's also designed when it goes out to the tribes. For instance, now the Wind River community is taking on this curriculum, and they want to teach it in their community. And they'll replace the creation stories we have here in the East with their own creation stories and our own historical injustices from our own region. They will insert their own cultural stuff in there. So some pieces wouldn't change at all. The only things that would change is those local historical, things that happen. And hopefully we're going to be able to have this curriculum translated into Spanish, because in the HUD communities there are many people whose primary language is Spanish. So that's in the next year, something that we want to do. So let's see, pretty soon I'll be able to entertain some questions. I think that may have been my last slide. Yes. So, I'm hoping for some good questions.
Strong Oak, just quickly, folks are wondering if they can have access to the PowerPoint after the webinar.
Oh, yes.
Okay, then just so everyone knows, thank you. I'll be sending that along as an attachment as in the follow-up email to all participants. And yeah, if folks have questions, they can go ahead and type those into the chat box, and we will read them out loud before answering.
Yeah.
And Strong Oak, while we wait for folks to get their sorry, I'm a little under the weather. While we wait for folks to get their thoughts together, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how Visioning B.E.A.R's coalition, how y'all navigated like the dominant culture's concepts about time and efficiency.
Oh, yeah. First place, we are figuring out like a natural organic experience. Like we find that if you have 8 people and 4 teachers, really you need 2.5 hours to really give people the time that they really need. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing, we're developing based on what the natural flow of a conversation on a given topic is. And what we're finding is that we got like 100% attendance on these groups. That's stunning in itself, but mostly because people so enjoy it. It's really different than what you would hear. Like when we talk about respect, it gets into areas that you don't usually address when you talk about respect. So, like for instance, we'll talk about, like respect for the plant world and all that it's given to us. And we go into things like at one time the world, ate much more variety of food because they ate more wild foods that are now becoming like people don't know which wild foods are safe to eat anymore. When people started living in place and staying in one spot, they begin to deplete the earth. And we get into a lot of, things about like when you, for instance, a lot of people don't know some stunning things. For one thing, that you change the forest when you go in the forest, especially if you're aware of all the plants and the trees and you begin to have conversations and relations with these things. It changes. I remember when I moved to Western Mass, I found that out in a really deep, profound way. I used to go to the same tree and spring and a space where I used to meditate, and I would put cornmeal and tobacco around the same tree for years. And then I was getting ready to move to Western Mass, and I spoke to the tree about it, and I spoke, to the spaces around me about it. And, I used to there was like these nice natural openings, and I'd put crystals and tobacco and all kinds of stuff in there, and I really was appreciative of having a nice place to go because I was living in the city at the time. And when it was time for me to leave, I went for the last time, and all of a sudden, overnight, this mysterious incredible amount of poison ivy showed up around the tree. Like it was grieving too, and it didn't want anybody coming near it at that point. And it was just really profound. In the space where I meditated, all of a sudden these two trees came to block that path too. And I just thought, oh my goodness, there's a grieving going on, not just for me, but for all of the plants that were going to miss me and the trees that were going to miss me. And, and how I got my name, I did a vision quest by a really large, white oak tree in New Braintree, actually close to not far from where I live. And that was just, I felt love from that tree, like from cross species kind of thing, was remarkable. And then for me to eventually, when I was there, my name was Irene. When I came out, I got the name Strong Oak from the elders after my experience with the tree. So that's how I got my name, from the tree. So I've had a lot of experience like that. And when people take the curriculum, they begin to have a lot of experience like that. And then if you think about if children have that kind of sacred relationship with their environment, it's hard to not realize that you're important in some ways, that because the plants need you. Like, for instance, I love the idea that tobacco grows best when it smells smoke. It's like there's a relation in everything, that, sweetgrass grows best when it's tended and picked. So people, want to be experienced and appreciated no matter what species you are. And that's a big prevention to teach that kind of thing. And it's a fact, that these things happen. And people experience it directly. And when that begins to happen, like one of the children in the HUD community I work with, they just love to collect stones. So I'm going to make a point of showing this person how you can ask for a question or an issue that you need some wisdom about, and if you ask the question and go look for a stone, you'll find one that will teach you what you need to know by looking at it. And those are kind of profound things. So anyway, I think that what we really wanted to do is address a process of living that valued every single thing that we experience, and not counteract a culture that monetizes everything, objectifies everything, measures it, nature as a cash crop. You see the impact on climate change. You see the struggle between those who want to develop the land and those who want to sustainably live upon it. And the fact that most people today wouldn't be able to take care of themselves very easily because we've been so torn from the land that we don't know how to live sustainably on it. If there were a natural disaster, all of a sudden you have to, we're used to food wrapped in cellophane and going to the supermarket and having all of our food grown in particular areas and depleting the soil upon which we grow it. So, it's so much different when people get into having a connection with the food that they eat and the world that they live in and the trees that surround them. So we feel that, it's violent to treat everything like it's a crop and that it has a cash value. That in itself is a source of violence. So that was how we developed this. We just didn't want to live this way. We wanted to, realize that every single person has the same needs. Like in Visioning B.E.A.R, everyone gets paid the same amount of money, no matter what job you do. And the trainers get the same as the staff, and the board and the staff have complete transparency. We sit in circle, staff and board together. And if anybody from the community is in any of those spaces, their voice is equal. So we do everything by consensus by those present, not by whether you're a board member, whether you're a staff member. So we actually have this curriculum completely informing how we exist. We went through a struggle when we became a 501c3 because we were, worried about the inherent hierarchy in that. And at first, we kind of said, well, the president of the board, the chair of the board. Someone even suggested having our meetings with Robert's Rules, but we got over that very fast. We said, no, we're a circle, and we do everything by consensus, and we put it in our bylaws that consensus ruled the way in which we made our decisions. So it's doable. Like we figured out a way to be a circle in this hierarchical world, in a 501c3 world. We figured out how to be a circle and to have every part of this curriculum reflected in our own structure. So that's something I would be happy to share with anyone. In fact, we are doing that, sharing our bylaws with other groups that want to do the same. Some people choose to get fiscal sponsors for that very reason. So anyway, I'll stop here. As the older I get, the more I can talk, it seems.
No, that was fabulous. I think what I'm getting from that is just really that you couldn't use what would be a violent way of evaluating a program that's trying to end violence.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why we have the complete team. Like anyone can come. And there's been some profound things that have happened from doing things that way. It's just a joy for me to even be part of it. Oops. For a minute, my screen disappeared because I wasn't moving anything. So, but anyway, even the curriculum development team is that way too. I didn't talk about that. Every week we have a curriculum development team where everyone's involved in editing that's teaching the curriculum. The only criteria is that you've had some experience teaching it. And so that's a growing group of people. And now we're going to have, we're looking at, we think because of, in some instances, there'll be people living ongoing with this as the way in which they run their, our Indigenous gatherings. Like we're about to get a piece of land where we'll have continuous gatherings on it, and traditional arts we can teach, and then community gardens and all of this, and maybe some longhouses and tiny houses, we'll see. But it's like that will all be decided in circle, and all the conflicts that come up. That's the other thing I didn't say. This curriculum focused so much on conflict resolution and having skills to resolve conflict in a way that benefits everyone. It's inherent in every single one of the modules. Is this commitment to seeking harmony and peace, which inherently means you have to deal with conflicts that come up. So we don't go with somebody wins, somebody loses. We go with understanding what went behind it, and coming to a place where everyone benefits and everyone's in agreement. And so we have, a circle that has that kind of respect built in. And we find that consensus is really good when people know how to do it. You get a lot done. If you look at how much Visioning B.E.A.R has done since we got incorporated in 2014, it is incredible. I just look at the remarkable amount of work we've done and say that's what consensus can do. because we talk about everything all at once. We have an issue we're dealing with, not so much an agenda, so we don't put time frames on everything. So we not only teach the curriculum this way, we run everything this way. Our decision and leadership model is built on this. And like we talk at a lot of things all at once, but they're all interconnected. And by the time this circle has gone around a few times, all of a sudden now we made several decisions at once. Because it's hard to take one part of a problem and make a decision on that one part without looking at all the other parts. Don't you think?
Absolutely. So if folks have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box. And Strong Oak, I was wondering, back in when you first started working with the outside evaluators, when they were thinking about, measures for, measuring the change in the community, measuring like the levels of violence, were there any typically used measures that typically are used in like mainstream or dominant culture programs that that y'all had to say to evaluators, no, that's not going to work with us, that's not going to capture anything for us?
Oh yeah, actually the team was configured a little differently when we first started out, and I think that if you're a really conventional evaluator and you expect just a lot of data and then you could just plug it in or whatever, this is a very arduous, confusing and messy process. Because before getting into this, because I'm so into evaluation now, it's like I was not. My attitude towards evaluation was secretly what some may say is it's a tool for the government to not fund you, because you have to prove that this, and this. And also, I once belonged to, where you could actually manipulate, research can be manipulated to come out the way you want it if you're really skilled at that. And I knew that from some other professional evaluation team that I was a part of in a drop-in center program that I was part of. And so I wasn't like a real devotee of evaluation. But now I am, if your goal is really to see what impact and you can really have. And so we had to change one of the members on the team at one point to someone with a more progressive outlook about how to do evaluation, especially people who are really interested in the cultural pieces of this. So all along, Visioning B.E.A.R had to say, this isn't working for us, this isn't working for us, and also our time frame was slower than most people wanted. Mm-hmm. It took us longer to get things done, it seemed, because we were going organically based on what we were presented with. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the stuff we came up with was trial and error, both for ourselves and for the evaluators. So I think coming up with the questions for each module, I can't even recall. I know it was all done together with the team, because when we decided what topic we were going to have, then we came up with these questions. It's hard for me to remember now whose idea was what, because everything's done in circles. But the questions were designed initially. I didn't say this because this was a big shift. We had it as a pre-question. We would ask, the question I put up on respect. How does respect impact? And we use childhood sexual assault at the beginning, but now we use children's safety because it takes into account intersections and it's much more positive and brings more people to the table, including harm doers. But anyway, those questions were designed as a pre-post. So initially we would have the question in the first round of the day after the check-in, and then about 2 rounds in we would ask the same question again. We found that people were confused about being asked that question twice, but it was designed as a pre-post. And then we found that wasn't really effective because we didn't find a lot of shift in that particular format of what you first said and what you said then, 2 rounds in. So we got rid of that post question, but we kept asking, the question and doing it on the cards because we found that it focused the group. And the first question was more in deep because people took 5 minutes to think about it before we started. So we found that out. And again, that was all done in a team format. And then we check what doesn't work and we keep what does. And then we make a shift. We change a question. And so we got rid of, by getting rid of that pre-post piece of the question and asking it twice, we gifted ourselves more time in the circle because that was timely. Think about, going around the second question, even if people only, talk for a minute, it still takes a lot of time, and people don't talk for a minute. They really were spending a lot of time going way beyond what you put on a 3x5 card, especially on the second go-around. So we found that it wasn't useful. It wasn't giving us the data that, warranted keeping it. And then we, found that the last question really captured things more deeply than asking the same question twice. So that's kind of how, the best thing I could say about this is it's taken people with being able to work with a team approach, people having the humility to listen what the trainers are saying, and then hearing the frustrations that we had, because people really are having, initially had a great deal of struggle about the 4 to 6 questions that the evaluators wanted us to do. And we knew that we could ditch it if we wanted. And we decided we wanted to try this out and give it a shot because and go and work with our evaluators on that. And we'll see how that works. But I'm beginning to see how it is. Like when you look at people who are not evaluators, you don't necessarily think like an evaluator, and so they can see something you may not see. But you, as the people who have to teach it, have things to say that they need to hear as well. So it took a while for people to realize that principles were like behavior. Based on Michael Quinn Patton's view, because to us principles and values looked almost like the same, but we're saying no. Principles, people will act on their principles, and that's a behavior. And the values underneath there. Are you still there? Oh, okay. All right. Okay, you're still there?
Yes. Still here.
Okay. Okay, I had a call coming in that I needed to, not have. So anyway, I hope this is explaining things. It's so organic, and we do have struggles, and they're very freely expressed in our team meetings, and they're really useful because it gets people thinking. I was impressed with some of the depth, and some of the community educators are really into this. And they do a lot of research on their own. It's kind of wonderful to see that, coming into play when we get together. So it's sort of like, to me, it's kind of a great evaluation process because we're looking for how to make the whole thing better and capture the information that we want to capture. And we're into sharing this with whoever wants it because we feel like it's so important to document behavior change. And so hard to do. And it certainly beats these little slips of paper that ask you, do you strongly agree, what one thing did you learn, what are you taking with you? And most of the people don't fill it out. Right. And actually, I have found myself when I've done stuff at NSAC that sometimes I feel like the people who fill it out are not the people that were most impressed with what I did, that people who had some kind of thing to say about it, I don't know. But it's like, because half of the people don't fill it out, that skews those results, because you have to figure out, well, why did some do and some not? But this, it's 100% of the people. You get 100% of the evaluation from the people who participated because it's structured into the circle itself. And that is the key thing. And people don't have to fill out a piece of paper. Indigenous people do not like to fill out pieces of paper, I can tell you this. I would be lucky if I got 2. It's like, people just not into it. And it's because we're basically an oral people. And, but it's like to get 100% participation in the evaluation process is a huge deal to me. And to hear, and when you're writing grants, to have direct quotes from people that are accurately stated is an awesome thing as well. And I think that's the hardest part here is going to these 4 to 6 questions. Is everybody feels envisioning that we already document behavior change, and but in a usable way of, I think these 4 to 6 questions could actually measure something that we're not getting in those individual things that we ask each session. So I want these 4 to 6 questions to really add to the process and not replace anything, but to really focus more on cumulative impact. And then we want to develop some longitudinal tools to go with this, which we think we can do because we'll have people years later that will be, living according to this, and we'll be able to measure longitudinal impact on these values over a long period of time. And the other thing I didn't tell you is that we're developing stories to go with them for children. Like each module will have stories, and that will, so it's, like little children that are toddlers. In the Indigenous culture, there are all these stories where you impact and the socialization by transmission of stories. Not the ones, where the big bad wolf gets you, that kind of thing. When you look at some of the childhood stories the dominant culture has come up with, they're really not the values you really want to teach. Think about it. So I can think of a few, stories that I wish I'd never heard. But anyway, we want to come up with stories that model what's in these things, like compassion and humility and all of these things.
Yeah,
and we have an elder storyteller with us now too, so on our board.
That's fabulous. We look forward to having you back for those updates when that has all been developed. There is a question. I see a question in the chat box, Strong Oak. It's a 2-parter. Someone would like to know, how do we effectively model restorative community justice and include space for folks to name and own the violence they have committed, while also prioritizing the safety of survivors in the space? And then they say, of course, by the nature of cyclical violence, nearly all have both experienced and enacted harm. How do we hold space for that without shame and judgment, while also doing our best to protect one another from being repeatedly re-traumatized?
That's an excellent question. Actually, it seems to be a natural outgrowth of these circles to have the no judgment that comes in when you can't do judgment. You can't react to someone what they said, the harm that they did. I think it's the safety of your space, really meaning it that there's not going to be judgment, listening fully without interfering or making comments, and just fully listening to the fullness of what that person is saying. And actually the key is being able to have these kind of places where people who have done harm can come and find a way to healing and shifting their lives and transforming their lives to a space where they don't do violence going forward. And we can only do that when we recognize the violence in ourselves, that every one of us has had this. And because you can say it, it's the circle itself that seems to do that. And in the Indigenous culture, we see the circle as a special thing. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm going to try. It's not about, for us, this circle is like the structure itself is where the safety resides. When you get, if people can be seen as a full human being, they can come forward with their harm without feeling shame or judgment. And that is the key. But you have to actually experience it. So you may not start out that way, but if you're going through 12 sessions where that kind of trust is built up, eventually you get to the place where you feel so safe you can say the most difficult things. We're finding that people can say the most difficult things they did without other people judging them. And people will then bring forward their stuff, and pretty soon people are realizing that we're all on this continuum, all seeking to be living in harmony and peace and be happy. And part of that means, being able to be seen and all of our foibles, and everything we've done and the humanity of all of that. And, it just works. I think the circle itself makes it work. It's not a one-time thing. And there's, because we don't teach it as a one-time experience, but we've had fabulous experience by simply asking that question. Like, we had a bunch of providers. This was incredible. A bunch of survivors doing this work. I don't know about you, but like when you work in a domestic and sexual violence field, sometimes the staff, you don't even know each other, how you came to the work. You don't have time to even get into that. And we had a circle of providers, and we were all talking about dealing with social justice. And one of the questions that we ask is, when is, say like a time when you were harmed, what you would have needed from your family, your friends, and your community in order to restore yourself to wholeness. And then we ask the second question, if you have done harm, what would you need to restore yourself to wholeness and the community and the people that you harmed to wholeness? What would you need for you to be able to make amends, for those harms? And, those are profound questions to ask. And so we ask people to do both sides of that. When you were harmed, what you would have needed. And the key is focusing on the community and restoring the community to wholeness. And recognizing there are a few people who have harmed us who have been so completely, I'll use the word evil, that they had no saving graces. A lot of people for domestic and sexual violence are people who harmed us, are people we know, people who had some parts of them that were, good and maybe even wonderful, and other parts where they did this incredible harm, and that made the harm even more painful. And then, a lot of people expressed to me in all the years that I've worked, a lot of people who have been victimized all wanted for the person to understand the harm they had done, and they wanted to have connection. Many, as you think about people, sometimes actually contacting the person because they actually have feelings for them. So to be able to help someone come to a place of healing and get treatment and be able to be part of the community again really benefits everybody, including the people who are victimized. Doesn't mean you bring them back in your life, but it means you can move on with your life and give again, knowing that at least there's been some acknowledgement of the harm done to you. And in some cases, there can even be some restoring in that relationship in a safe way. But safety and accountability are the key. So the only way you can really do it is through a prism of accountability and healing. And, those things will work. So that's a pretty full way to answer that question, I think.
Great, thank you. And I do want to note for folks, and I can send links for everyone for this, that the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women this past year has done some really great in-depth webinars on restorative and transformative justice practices, and kind of like the kind of nitty-gritty of keeping folks safe while honoring everyone's humanity. So I can link to those in the email follow-up.
Yeah, there was a recent example I have of something like that where this woman, she was on a campus and she'd been friends with this person for a long time. And, he made, a boundary violation with her without her consent, and she addressed it with him and he apologized and they continued to see each other. But then he repeated that behavior down the way, and so she ended up having to sever that relationship, at least temporarily, and her only way that she could ever even think about having that relationship restored, because she does miss this person and they do have these other really great qualities, is that they would have to have a circle or some way to have mediation or something in order to be safe on the campus and also safe with each other. If they're, and she seemed to want to have some kind of connection with this person. She was dealing with the loss of her friend, but she was clearly not going to put up with any more transgressions around boundaries with her. So she was struggling with that. And she afforded that person the opportunity, if he were willing, to participate in a restorative justice circle where, they could decide how they could each be on this campus safely and avoid, going into a legal issue. But she knew all of her rights around the legal issues as well under Title IX. And, so we had a full discussion about it. But it's a complex problem. And, and that each person would have a different way they want to deal with it. And it should be the person who's harmed who is the determiner of that.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions coming through. So I guess we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Strong Oak, for sharing all of this with us. And again, we really look forward to having you back to talk some more as the evaluation process and the curriculum are published and developed more. I will be sending out the slides and in a few days the recording of this webinar, and the Strong Oaks webinar from last week is also available on NSCASA's website. I'll send the link to that as well. And so yeah, great. Thank you all for joining us. And I've included Strong Oak. I put your contact info for folks into the chat if they have any more questions about the curriculum and want to get in touch.
That's great. I would love to hear from folks.
Yep. All right. Okay. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the holidays if you celebrate. Bye.
Bye-bye.